Welcome to the American Planning Association podcast. This episode is part of our series on planning the autonomous future, which looks at the many ways in which autonomous technology will impact our cities and regions, mobility, and the planning profession. I'm your host, Jennifer Henaghan, Deputy Research Director and Manager of the Green Communities Center at the American Planning Association. With me is my co-host, Kelley Coyner.
I'm Kelley Coyner. I'm the CEO of Mobility E3, a new technology consulting firm that focuses on helping communities make sure that automated mobility makes them more accessible, healthier, and safer places to live.
In this episode, we're talking to mobility rock star Lisa Nisenson, founder of Greater Places and an advisor to Alta Planning and Design. She also holds several leadership positions in APA's Sustainable Communities Division and Smart Cities Task Force.
Now, Lisa, we started working together on the topic of how to plan for the AV future, it's been 18 months ago? And in dog years or something, that's been like eons ago. And I just remember when we were sitting there scratching our heads trying to figure out what planners should know and be thinking about in terms of strategies, you came up with a really cool way of doing that.
Well, thank you, first and foremost, for inviting me to be on the podcast. I do believe that scenario planning is emerging as an essential tool and as an essential skill in every planner's practice, whether they're public sector or private sector. And the reason is that there are so many lines of disruption, for lack of a better word. I know it seems like it's jargon or overused, but to be sincere, our worlds are changing, and it's a planner's job to get in front of it and help manage risk and help to actually leverage benefits, even though you don't know exactly how things are going to go.
So what is scenario planning anyway?
So to quote a friend, she asked me, so you're just making stuff up, right? Except she didn't use the word stuff. And so it is some educated guesses based on what you know about communities, what you know about trends, and how you can forecast into the future of what things are possible, what's plausible, and then you can lead conversations as to what's preferred. So part of what we need to do is to look at these lines of disruption. Of course, autonomous vehicles is the one that seems to loom the largest, but there's other technology advances occurring in other matters we deal with. So even parking is being disrupted right now by technology. Shuttles are being disrupted, whether there's a driver or not. Bicycles right now are one of the most interesting aspects of innovation right now. So as planners, we can't really pick and choose. We may have to stack those up together and figure out, okay, if we're going to get started, where do we start? What's the most achievable, lowest risk, highest benefit? But then once we start adopting that, what are the other interlinking parts going on? So you may have bicycles, shuttles, and autonomous transit all at the same time. And scenario planning helps you actually make stuff up with an informed guess as to how that's going to play out in the future, what's plausible and what you want.
Now, scenario planning isn't a new tool.
No, it's not. And thank you for bringing that up. Actually, scenario planning has its roots in the military, what's called war games. It also has its roots in the business world, where a business may also see that their line of, whether it's products or services, are changing with the changing times, and how do they stay out in front of competitors. So you've seen this actually in oil companies have been doing this for a long time. It really became part of the planner's toolbox at the regional level around the 1980s, when regional government started especially trying to deal with sprawl. So dealing with scenarios that were a business as usual versus compact versus centers and corridors. So you could see people begin to line up these different ways of growing and then determine what the different metrics were surrounding those different scenarios. Then you also saw the rise of some of the computer-assisted tools that could also help with scenario planning in ways we didn't have before. So in general, we've been able to, at a regional level, compare different scenarios. That was then, and this is now, where we're trying to weave in getting our arms around uncertainty rather than just 2 or 3 different scenarios.
So, Lisa, I get to claim another title, which is your colleague in crime, as we look to try to figure out what to do about planning the AV future. And I wondered if you might tell a little bit about how you've put together these scenarios and what it's like when we go into one, to what we're trying to find out, how we play it out, what tools someone should have to do that.
So there are general templates for how you approach scenario planning, but it really all begins in what product do you want out of your scenario planning exercise. And then you work backwards and structure the scenario planning exercise to deliver that end product. Now, what do I mean by end product? It could be a memo to the mayor who basically said, let me know what is happening and how it impacts land use, transportation, economic development. So then you'd structure a scenario planning to answer those questions. It could be that you want a plan update. So you would structure your sessions another way. Going back to our experience, our very first scenario planning exercise was with the ENO Center for Transportation's Convergence Conference, where we actually structured a workshop with about 100 people just around a simple question. And it was basically, what would it take to get an autonomous shuttle on the streets in a neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia? And we spent a lot of time on our first one, as you always do with the first one, figuring out how do we take an audience and leverage their knowledge and what they've learned at at the Convergence Conference into a roadmap for how to get AVs on the road, how to get an AV shuttle that is on the road. And in the end, I think we did a pretty good job, but the various pieces that had to come together were, first and foremost, number one, homework. You want people to come into the room with the ability to put together some of these different pieces and what the unknowns are. So if you ask me what the first thing a scenario planning exercise does, number one is homework. The second one that I thought was your idea that was really, really good was actually having scenarios in an actual place so that people had a connection to that place. And number three, you had the introductory speakers actually be 3 stakeholders in getting this shuttle on the streets. And so we had
David Vosler from Local Motors, which was looking at the Ollie. We had a representative from the local bid who was very interested in showcasing this innovation. We had Steve Taylor, who's with Lyft, and Lyft is looking at taking more than 50% of its rides to autonomous in less than 5 years. And it seems like we had another...
Vornado, were they there?
They were there. That was... then we had a developer who was sponsoring the project. We've done other ones where we've had planners play part of the role, and we've had elected officials also play. But that was a lot of fun. I thought that was the most fun thing that we did, because they popped up from the tables, and they just talked about what their questions were, the way that they do every day when they're trying to work through these problems. And they had good questions for planners about what planners needed.
Right. The second thing that is almost a thread that runs through all of these is structuring a question in several parts. And the first one we did is, okay, we want you to spend 30 minutes brainstorming 2 columns. The first column, everything that could go right, and the second column, everything that could go wrong. And I think if you've read enough articles about the future of autonomous vehicles, that's a common way, a common framework for thinking, because this new technology does pose both very big benefits and very big risks. And then you had shared learning around the table as well, because people came at it from very different backgrounds and geographies. And that was a really enriching way to make sure that very fast, very efficient, you got people's knowledge on the table and they shared with each other. So that second part, asking questions and brainstorming, was very essential. And then once we got those questions or those risks and benefits on the tables, we took a break and we came back and said, okay, what do you do about it? And in this case, we gave them several different structured buckets, if you will, of answers. And it could be policy, it could be funding, it could be other regulations. We looked a lot at safety as well. But in that way, you get those levers and people thinking about what is under your control, so that you might be able to take proactive steps now or start laying the groundwork. So by the time autonomous vehicles come, you've got those regulations in place. You've got that funding in place. You've fixed your infrastructure. It's up to snuff. So in general, that's the 3-part session we led at a workshop for an organization.
Right. And I think that's a really good example, too, of what we were trying to get out of it, is how we structured it. Mm-hmm. This was a year and a half ago, and we wanted to know what kind of questions planners had. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to think about what were the strategies at different levels of government that might help move deployment forward safely. But in our working on things since then, you've developed other tools and other ways, some that are much more focused. I love the grocery store example. Can you talk about that?
Oh, okay. So over the past year, as we've been invited to talk with other groups, and each one is just a little bit different, academia or a local government or a transit agency, that's where it really became clear that the way you structure a scenario planning exercise varies based on who the group is and what you want out of it. So with one group, we decided that we would use the scenario planning to design the grocery store of the future. And a lot of this was spurred by Amazon's recent purchase of Whole Foods.
Oh, right.
And at that point, a lot of light bulbs went off and people were like, holy cow, why would Amazon buy Whole Foods? And then all of a sudden it started making sense about not just the future of the grocery store, but the future of how people get goods and the future of how goods get to stores. And just really, what does the store look like when so much is moving to e-commerce and delivery? And even if you go to a Whole Foods or other grocery store right now, the pickup and the delivery, those lockers and the people who are using those lockers are always busy. So it has hit its stride. But then when you start forecasting the future, we started looking at, well, what's going to happen with autonomous delivery pods? What's going to happen with drones? What's going to happen as fresh vegetables come to the grocery store in ways that we can't even imagine right now? What's going to happen when Amazon and others are purchasing this real estate so that they can get closer to their goal of getting anything you order within an hour? And for an urban planner, that is both exciting and frightening at the same time, because it means there's going to be a proliferation of warehouse space. And we think of that as industrial, not neighborhood. But what happens and how does that act when all of a sudden driverless or unmanned or unwomaned or whatever you want to call it, when it makes it so cheap and easy for someone to actually order throughout the day instead of like the grocery store where you have to pick up a cart full of stuff. So that at 8 a.m. you're ordering milk, and then at 10 p.m. you run out of cereal. And so all of a sudden a drone is going to deliver grape nuts to your door. And think about that, hairbrushes, varnish, whatever, throughout the day. And as planners, what's that experience look like in the competition for quote unquote free public rights of way to operate air drones, ground drones, delivery trucks, even people on bicycles.
I love that idea of using the grocery store as a sort of a conversation starter, because it's a deceptively simple concept. Everyone's, oh, I understand a grocery store, but then you can easily see how that quickly spins off into all these other really big sort of unknowns.
Right. And really, there's this whole move towards experiential retail, and we need to start thinking about, and even now it's happening that way, where my local Whole Foods has music night on Fridays where bands come in and play live music. There's happy hour every day. I think they serve food. It's just gotten to be a place you want to go to hang out with friends or family, because no matter how much we buy online, we still want those civic and those communal experiences. That's not going to go away. But really, where that happens, how that happens, is shifting under our feet. And if you look at zoning codes and allowable uses, we really need to start thinking about whether or not we can create the places that people want and that will build community in an era where uses is changing rapidly.
I think the other thing that was interesting about doing the grocery store exercise, Lisa literally started it using me as a planning group of one as we worked on a report, but then she came and did it with my AV planning and policy seminar I've been teaching this spring. And it really also illustrated the grocery store being a mobility hub.
Right.
That there were not only all the mobility of things coming in and out, and people coming in and out, and how they got there and what those deliveries looked like, but how it intersected with transit, and how it was part of placemaking in a suburban environment that wasn't as dense. It was a really interesting exercise in sort of really thinking about all the different ways that automation changes the mobility hub.
And it was one of your students who came up with this great story. And so we started talking about why people don't take transit to the grocery store. And of course, it deals with having to carry around a lot of stuff. Some of it is heat or cold sensitive. And so we were talking about all these different modes and delivery bots and things. And she came up with this brilliant idea of, what if you had this personal bot assistant that went with you, that was basically your shopping cart, that basically racked up your bill as you went up and down the aisles. But as you go to the bus stop right outside, if the new design of buses had almost like a click-in portal where your delivery bot would click into the side of the bus, when you got off, it would unclick and follow you home.
How cool is that?
And if you're elderly or blind, but it would be a way to, and I think everything that is happening now in the world of planning is this fear that autonomous vehicles are actually going to disrupt transit in a way that makes transit unviable. There's other voices that are basically saying, we have a limited right of way in our streets. We can't build anymore. So the future has got to figure out how we efficiently move all different modes, so transit still plays a gigantic role in making sure that we have that mobility we need and the experience that makes it pleasant to be traveling both in traffic and alongside traffic and underneath traffic, if you think about overhead drones.
Can you tell us a little bit about how other people are using scenario planning and what tools are being developed?
So in urban planning and some of this planning for uncertainty, there have been some great leaders working with the American Planning Association. So going back to 2015, Arnad Chakraborty and Andrew McMillan actually published in the Journal of the American Planning Association a guide, an article, Scenario Planning for Urban Planners, toward a practitioner's guide. And that really takes you back to the foundation of people who were already planning about planning for uncertainty. And even since then, you've seen a proliferation. So now the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy has created the consortium for scenario planning to take all these different innovators really in the craft who are putting together the resources that planners will need. Janae Futrell is in Atlanta, and she has her own consulting practice called Civic Sphere. And she really specializes in people who need to disentangle complex systems and figure out the future and then put those systems back together. So I highly recommend some of our own APA members who are doing this fantastic work. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention Hannah Twaddell, who's now with ICF. And then the people behind Urban Footprint, which is a new computer tool. I want to take a little bit to talk about tool versus no tool, because there's a little bit of, I would say, uncertainty about when do you use tools and when do you not use tools. According to Hannah and Janae, they basically say put away all the tools at the beginning because they can be awfully distracting. They can give you a false sense of certainty. And in a fast-changing world, if you're relying on numbers, what was an accurate number yesterday may not be an accurate number today. But it really does facilitate out-of-the-box thinking if you can put away the tools and the parameters and just think about the future, where it might be going, and most importantly, where you want the future to go. So how can you get your arms around it and steer things in a way that you get more of what you want and you address what you don't want up front?
Well, I'll take this opportunity to give a little plug for an upcoming APA resource. We've been working with the Lincoln Institute and also Janae Futrell on creating a new research knowledge base resource collection specifically on scenario planning. So APA members will be able to go there and find all sorts of different tools and resources to help them learn about the topic and how to apply it.
Right. And it's good you're doing that because this idea of it being expensive and technical really does limit, at least in some people's minds, a tool that they really should be using. And one of my favorite uses is for civic engagement up front, because scenario planning does let you enter into uncomfortable conversations about change and the future and anxiety. And with so much changing, it does help to invite people to a process of forecasting, of homework, of what you want in ways that our public workshops typically don't.
One of the things I found over the last year is a real search for how to deal with different kinds of planning questions. Mm-hmm. One of them is in the area of long-range planning, when we're called upon to figure out what the future will look like, and we don't have the data to support it. I always remember asking someone, how could we integrate AV planning into your long-range planning? And he said, no, you can't do that. We don't have the data. And the problem is, then the future's going to create you beforehand. So one way that it's been used is to offer different scenarios for the impact on population growth and on transportation growth and on revenues that come into the city. Mm-hmm. And then a really cool one that APA has helped move forward, which is helping really visualize what the future might look for, is that we've just, with in cooperation with APA, Mobility E3 has created a visual simulation tool that lets someone see what an AV looks like on the street, and the tool allows you to input data that contemplates different kinds of scenarios. So we are able to show what it looks like to have an AV that doesn't exist in the United States now come down the street and drop people off and interact with pedestrians. I think that Hannah's right, that you don't want to set people's expectations at the beginning, but at the same time, it's a tool of gamification to be able to think about how these different things interact in a 3D context.
Exactly. And bringing up simulations is really important, because I think that's a second and complementary tool to scenario planning, is to be able to take some of these, especially the ones where some of the risks are pretty high, and feed them into, and then visualize different simulations of A versus B You can run through the whole alphabet if you want to, or different packages, so to speak, of scenarios. And that too, I think simulations is a big skill that's coming down. So if you're in school now or contemplating going to planning school, some of these are very important skills that are going to be needed very quickly.
Lisa, you got lots of great ideas. So boil it down to one wish you'd have for scenario planning in the AV space.
This is an easy one and one that I'm passionate about. It's basically using the scenario planning process to come up with scenarios that include transitions. So what is going to happen in the near term with existing and trending technology? What can you forecast reasonably for emerging technology? And then what questions do you need to ask about future technology? So let's talk about shuttles, actually, because right now, most cities do have shuttles in the form of private shuttles. So maybe airport or hotel shuttles, employer shuttles. Now we're seeing the rise of something trending called microtransit, where these can be on demand. There's one in our neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia that circulates around. And the city of Los Angeles actually has an RFP out and are going to be doing pilot projects on microtransit and how they can feed people to their subway stops and to their bus stations. So that's an example of near-term technology and coming up with the scenarios of how you might use them. But at some point, that also may inform where you want to deploy autonomous shuttles. And then what you want to do is think about in the near term, where are they going to go? What sort of safeguards am I going to need to plan now to get trust to actually deliver service? Is it going to have an operator, and for how long? Is it going to have its own segregated route? And for how long? So there's all these different scenarios and scenarios within scenarios. And then finally, how do you use that process to build towards something that is all on demand, autonomous shuttle in a service area? And if you want it to feed riders to transit, how do you even start today to build a system that considers that, so that you can go from what you have now to what you want, and the steps along the way and the different tipping points that tell you when to take bigger or different action. So that's a really good use of planning for transitions. And the same exercise applies for autonomous vehicles, for bike and bike share now, which is undergoing its own rapid evolution. It can apply to smart city technology, but thinking about existing, trending, emerging, and future technology along a timeline and figuring out how to plan for that gives you benefits now and lays the groundwork to limit risk in the future.
So if you're a planner who sees the potential for this and wants to get started, where do you go?
So APA is very good. And then my startup, Greater Places, is now being built so that we can get our arms around fast-moving technology. So if you think of HOUZZ, H-O-U-Z-Z for interior design, it's like that for cities. And it's really a rapid-fire best management practices tool so that you can stay ahead and help your clients. And there's interviews, there's research, there's examples, resources, kit and caboodle, so that we have it all in one place and can really stay ahead as individuals, as firms, as communities, and as the planning profession.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming and sitting down and talking with us today.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for tuning into another episode of the American Planning Association podcast. You can listen to past episodes at planning.org/podcasts. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Have an idea for a podcast? Email them to podcast@planning.org.